What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so picking up with the second half of Infinite Crisis, I really think that this second half is a lot easier to digest than the first. I know with the first half, I threw a lot at you guys, just because Geoff Johns, the way he writes his stories usually when it comes to these big crossover events, is the first part is here's all the stuff you need to know. Then the second part is and we're on to the action, and you get a good blend. It's just, Geoff Johns was using Infinite Crisis as a way to wrap up a lot of different things, to remove a lot of different things from the DC landscape. Now, some of this was editorial. For example, when we get to the segment about Dick Grayson, we'll actually find out that editorial had a different intention than what we saw in the story itself. But there were a lot of things that ended up happening behind the scenes that influenced how this story was done, because DC was looking to Infinite Crisis to change things up. Now, I think this makes a really good talking point, because at the end of the last video, we talked about how the multiverse had returned. And the idea here is that with Crisis on Infinite Earths, it was a line-wide reboot. I mean, it was a hard reboot. Everything was just reset from one. With Infinite Crisis, it's not that way. Geoff Johns really just kind of comes along and says, well, you get to stay and you get to stay, you got to go, but you get to stay and you get to stay. It's really just kind of going through and basically just revitalizing characters and returning them to their roots. And this is never more so evident than when we pick up with the return of the multiverse and the restoration of Earth 2. Now remember, Earth 2 is basically the universe where all the Golden Age heroes existed. So basically all the superheroes, if you do Google searches or you look them up or anything, all the superheroes that were first created in the 1930s, the 1940s, and the really early part, the first 5 years of the 1950s, that was all Golden Age stuff. When the multiverse is recreated by Alexander Luthor, suddenly people like Jay Garrick just begin vanishing all over the place, and no one knows where they are. Of course, Earth 2 Superman, Earth 2 Lois Lane, they vanish as well. What we find out is that they've been sent to Earth 2, and so really what's happening here is Geoff Johns is basically saying, after Crisis on Infinite Earths, a lot of the characters who were introduced before Crisis on Infinite Earths in the multiverse on a different Earth, they were just kind of rolled over into the main DC continuity in the new Earth continuity after Crisis on Infinite Earths. But because the multiverse is back, basically all these different heroes are going to the Earths where they first appeared at. So for example, we have members of the Shazam family that show up on Earth S, and the reason why is because before Crisis on Infinite Earths, the Shazam family existed on Earth S. And so that's basically what's happening here. It's just returning all these different characters back to where it was that they came from. Now, a huge majority, a bulk of these characters, characters like Batsman, I know I said Batsman in the other video, characters like Batsman, he stays simply because of the fact that he's just a character that's so popular that his Earth 2 counterpart's not going to be found. I mean, you're only going to see him on Earth 1. He's one of these weird exceptions. Switching back over to Batman himself, the idea is that with Brother Eye having had all these different OMACs and, kind of running amok and so on, Batman's main focus is to basically take out Brother Eye, eliminate Brother Eye from the equation, and then the OMACs will fall respectively. Because remember, the OMACs only exist because of the connection between Brother Eye and the OMACs. As soon as Brother Eye is destroyed, these nanobots, whatever it is that surround these normal humans, will basically deactivate, and these humans will go back to the way they were before. Now, in truth, this was just DC giving themselves an out, right? It was just a way of saying, hey, look, Brother Eye is going to be defeated, and it's not going to cost the lives of some, 2 million people in order to do it. They're all just going to go back to the way they were before. But the other half of this is we actually have Booster Gold bringing to Batman Jamie Reyes. Now, I call him Jamie Reyes. Some people like Joe call him Jaime Reyes. I think it really just kind of depends. I'm used to pronouncing it Jamie Reyes. I mean, that's I don't know why it would be pronounced a different way, but Jamie Reyes is basically the new Blue Beetle. Keep in mind, in Countdown to Infinite Crisis, we talked about how Ted Kord, the Blue Beetle at the time, was killed by Maxwell Lord. But the funny thing about this is that when it came to the Blue Beetle landscape, with the exception of Ted Kord, everybody has powers because of a scarab that they possess. Now, originally in DC Comics, the Blue Beetle was a man named Dan Garrett. Dan Garrett's history is a little fuzzy. If you go to Fox Feature Syndicate, or you were to look up Fox Feature Syndicate, what you would find out is that Blue Beetle at that point in time was more akin to a detective or something along the lines of Green Hornet, something similar to that, as opposed to the Blue Beetle that you most commonly think of. But the idea here is that when Blue Beetle Dan Garrett was effectively taken over by DC as a whole, his entire history and origin was revamped to a degree to where it was similar, but he actually had powers that were derived from a scarab. And the scarab effectively went away when Ted Kord became the new Beetle. And the reason why is because of the fact that DC was looking for a more grounded character, so the Blue Beetle scarab simply just existed as a a trophy in the room, or really in the base of operations for Ted Kord, and Ted Kord himself had no actual powers. He was just a super smart guy. But what ended up happening is because of the fact that Infinite Crisis was designed to fulfill Geoff Johns' desire to take a lot of comics, or as many as he could in terms of characters, and send them back to their roots, when we eventually saw Ted Kord stumble across the wizard Shazam and his efforts to figure out, what was going on with Maxwell Lord, Ted Kord was killed. The Blue Beetle scarab was left on Shazam. When the Rock of Eternity was destroyed by the Spectre, the Beetle scarab landed on Earth and then took possession of Jamie Reyes. And so what that meant is that Jamie Reyes went forward as the new Blue Beetle with powers. Now, the caveat to all this is that within this story, Infinite Crisis, and even going into like 52 and going into a lot of stories that focus on his character, the issue is that Jamie Reyes does not have any control of the Blue Beetle scarab. It operates with a will of its own. It's more instinctive or reactive than anything else. And so because of this is basically introducing his character into DC and showing us, or at least giving us an idea of what to expect. Now, of course, Booster Gold bringing in Jamie Reyes to Batman is done because of the fact that, remember, Booster Gold is a time traveler, and in his future, he already knows about the events that are going on right now. And what he tells Batman is, you're going to try to find Brother Eye. You're not going to be able to find it, but the Blue Beetle scarab can help you locate it because of the fact that it can allow its user to almost do anything they need to at any particular point in time. It's almost like the last white event with, Starbrand. For those of you guys who were familiar with with Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers. But the fact remains here that basically what Booster Gold says is Blue Beetle will help you find Brother Eye because you will not be able to locate it on your own. And so at this point, what we do is we switch back over to Earth 2. Now, with regards to Earth 2, we focus largely on Superman. And the idea was, remember, he was told by Alexander Luthor, if we restore the multiverse, then Lois Lane and you guys can go back to Earth 2 and Lois Lane will live, simply because of the fact that she was dying for reasons that we couldn't necessarily, weren't really explained. It was just kind of like the idea of old age or something along those lines. But despite being on Earth 2, Lois Lane dies anyway. Now, this is one of the most touching moments of the story. And the reason why is because of the fact that it is an absolute law of the universe that Superman always rescues Lois Lane. Superman could be in a village of children who are being bombarded by conventional warfare, and he will leave to save Lois Lane. But the idea here is this is Golden Age Superman. This is 1930s, 1940s, incorruptible Superman. Back in those days, he always saved Lois Lane. That was the crux of the story. Will Superman get to Lois Lane in time? Find out in the next issue. That was the way those stories were written back then. And so with Lois Lane dying, this is an experience that Earth 2 Superman has never felt before. There's never been an instance where he's ever had to even question whether or not Lois Lane was going to survive. He was always there. But with her death, with the scream that he lets out, the fact that he's feeling this much suffering and this much pain, it breaks the barrier between Earth 1 and Earth 2, and Superman on Earth 1 hears it. And that's how much suffering goes into the shout. That's how much suffering goes into the scream. Now, again, this is Geoff Johns kind of tying up all these loose ends and having, really going forward with the intention of returning superheroes back to the way they're supposed to be. Now, we'll find out with Final Crisis, a lot of that ends up getting changed by Grant Morrison, but what ends up happening here is we transition over to Wonder Woman, and Wonder Woman of Earth 1 is actually visited by Wonder Woman of Earth 2, the Golden Age Wonder Woman. And the cool thing about this is that the Golden Age Wonder Woman takes Earth 1 Wonder Woman, Diana, on this journey where she basically explains, look, you're not a hero right now. You're not acting like a hero. You don't need to prove yourself to anybody. Like, you've been a leader, you've been a queen, you have been an ambassador, you've done virtually everything. The only thing you need to be right now is human. And that's the coolest thing about this, because what Geoff Johns is basically saying is that in a lot of ways, the modern superheroes at the time this story was written, 2005, 2006, the superheroes had lost their humanity. They weren't superheroes anymore. It was almost like you could write this story as a precursor to Injustice Gods Among Us, right? Like, they lose their humanity. They lose what it is that makes them heroes. And because of this, they basically fight amongst each other. I mean, in the Injustice universe, they fight amongst each other, so on and so forth. In this story, it's a lot of the same way. They've lost their humanity. And in sight of losing their humanity, they fail to take into account that the actions that they engage in, especially Wonder Woman when she killed Maxwell Lord, have an impact that resonates beyond herself. Humanity won't say, well, oh my God, Wonder Woman killed Maxwell Lord. Wonder Woman is a terrible person. No. What humanity will say is, Wonder Woman killed Maxwell Lord. Wonder Woman's part of the Justice League. Superheroes are dangerous. That's exactly the way the events played out. And that's the case that Earth 2 Wonder Woman is making. Be a hero. Be human. Understand everyone makes mistakes. You've made mistakes. Batman makes mistakes. Superman makes mistakes. Learn from them and become a better person. And so because of this, we transition back over to Superman on Earth 2, and we end up having this really cool battle between himself and Superman on Earth 1. And that's kind of the funny thing here, because it's almost like experience versus experience. Which one comes out right here? But the funny thing about this is that it's actually Superman from Earth 1 that talks reason into Golden Age Superman. And the reason why I say that is because of the fact that Golden Age Superman is fighting out of anger. He's fighting out of wrath. He's fighting out of rage. And the reason why is he says Lois Lane didn't die because it was unavoidable. Lois Lane died because she was exposed to the corruption that is what makes you superheroes who you are. She was exposed to the corruption of your evil deeds. She was exposed to the corruption of your moral ambiguity, your willingness to do things that would basically make you a villain as opposed to being a hero. Now, the funny thing about this is Wonder Woman steps in. Wonder Woman basically says, look, you guys have to stop. And this is when Golden Age Superman really lets him have it. He says, you're not heroes, not in any sense of the word. You're anti-heroes. You're questionable heroes. Sometimes you do good things, but it doesn't atone for the bad things you do. And that's really what, that's the funny thing about this is a case could be made for that. Now, somebody in the comment section of the video about the OMAC project made a really good point where they were basically saying, look, if all the old stories were nothing but heroes doing the right thing all the time, that would get boring. Hence the reason why we started getting stories like The Dark Knight Returns and stuff like that, where we started seeing the darker side of heroes. But what Geoff Johns is saying is that is something that needs to be there. There needs to be a time when the morality of superheroes is questioned, when the morality of superheroes is ambiguous. That's something that needs to exist. The problem is when it becomes the status quo. That's the issue. Superheroes should always be something to look up to. They should always be something to aspire to. The humanity of heroes is what bridges the gap between them as, comic book characters and us as the reader, and it's what helps us identify with them. But what we don't want to read are stories where all we see is dark and drabby. What we don't want to see are stories where either it reflects the real world or it makes the real world look worse than it is. And so because of that, Superman says, you've lost your way. Now, the best counter argument to this is Superman from Earth 1. When Golden Age Superman's ranting on and he's talking about how he comes from a world where everything's perfect, Superman from Earth 1 says, well, that can't be possible because a perfect world wouldn't need a Superman. And so that's the beauty of all this, is because this is when Golden Age Superman begins to put two and two together, when he begins talking about, how Alexander Luthor's trying to find that one perfect Earth. This is when Golden Age Superman realizes Alexander Luthor is working against them. And so what we end up finding out is that with this giant tower that's been built, with, I guess a resemblance to the Anti-Monitor, that Alexander Luthor kind of switches over and basically says that for reasons that he can't begin to comprehend, for reasons he doesn't understand, the multiverse begins and ends with Superman. Now, there is an actual reason for this, but it's not tied directly into the comics. It's not like the multiverse was born directly from Superman in DC Comics. He's not the origin of the multiverse. The reason behind this actually goes all the way back to the 1950s. So going on a bit of a journey here, kind of time traveling a bit, back in the 1930s, 1940s, when Superman first showed up in comics, he could just jump really high, run really fast, and bullets could bounce off of him. But as time progressed, and especially, being influenced by his radio show where kryptonite was introduced for the first time, and with the Fleischer Studios, where they basically introduced the ability for him to fly, those were rolled over into the comics, but no explanation was given. It was just one day he could jump really high, the next day he could fly, and we didn't know why. And so what DC did is they came back in 1956 with Barry Allen, and they said, well, that was a different universe. That was Earth 2. Earth 1 is the universe that has the Flash Barry Allen. Now, because of this, what Geoff Johns is doing is using Alexander Luthor as a meta commentary by basically saying that it does all begin and end with Superman. The questions that led to DC introducing the multiverse all stemmed from the radical change in Superman's powers that were never explained. And so again, it's really just one of those funny kind of meta commentary things. But for those of you guys who are impatient, those of you guys who are tired of waiting, those of you guys who are like, I want to see Superboy Prime, this is when we get him. So the funny thing about this is that because a majority, or at least a lot of the different heroes that have existed on Earth that were originally created in, the Golden Age and had their own universes, because they've been switched back over to those universes, the ranks of the Titans and the Teen Titans have been absolutely decimated. I mean, half their numbers are gone, and they don't even know where those guys have gone to. And so because of this, it really comes down to Connor Kent and to Dick Grayson Nightwing to try to fend off, destroy this tower, and basically converge all the different Earths back into New Earth. And so what we do is we switch over to Tokyo, and we actually pick up with Bart Allen. Now, the funny thing about this is that it's not initially explained here. Instead, we just have Bart Allen emerging from the Speed Force as an adult wearing the Flash costume. And he begins just kind of rambling on and going on about nonsense, talking about how we couldn't hold him, we couldn't keep him contained. The question is asked, well, who are you talking about? And he says, it's him, it's Superboy Prime. So Superboy Prime has re-emerged from the Speed Force. God, I love this story, man. Let me tell you something, dude. God, I love Infinite Crisis, man. I love this story so much. So the funny thing is, switching back over to Batman, Booster Gold and Blue Beetle, again, this is just kind of a refamiliarity. It's reminding us of the power of this new Blue Beetle in the sense that he can basically vibrate through dimensional barriers. He can also reveal things that are hidden between dimensional barriers. Now, what this does is it basically deactivates the cloaking device of Brother Eye, and it allows Batman and everybody else to basically stow aboard and begin the process of trying to shut Brother Eye down. And so we just get all these little sequences, these small little subplots converging into one another to lead to the conclusion of this story. Really the last fight with Superboy Prime, within Infinite Crisis anyway. But the funny thing is, also switching over to Stonehenge, it's grabbing what's left of all the superheroes on Earth, and the Spectre suddenly appears and ends up destroying Deborah Carmille Darnell. Now, the reason why Deborah was destroyed, oh my God, Star Sapphire Deborah, the reason why she was destroyed is because of the fact that she is currently Star Sapphire around the time of Infinite Crisis. But Geoff Johns is going to go forward in the Green Lantern mythos and rework the entirety of the Star Sapphire mythos. And so he's basically like, she's in the way, she's not going to be part of the story that I'm making, we're just gonna get rid of her, and that's it, she's gone. No muss, no fuss, nobody really even asked any questions. It's just like, and she's gone now, and that's it. So it was just one of those funny little moments that sort of gets wrapped in there. But what we end up doing here is we basically switch over to Alexander Luthor continuing to experiment with the multiverse itself. This idea that Superman and Lex Luthor are destined to always be at odds with one another. That's one of the reasons why a lot of people who are reading DC Rebirth right now believe that Lex Luthor in the New 52 is gonna go back to being a bad guy, simply because of the fact that they read stories like Infinite Crisis, they see these lines that Geoff Johns threw out, the guy who wrote Infinite Crisis and is now the one controlling DC Rebirth, and they see things where Alexander Luthor says Superman and Lex Luthor are always destined to fight one another. So again, it's all these really cool moments. What we end up finding out is that with Cassie Sandsmark Wonder Girl basically joining alongside Dick Grayson and Connor Kent's Superboy to free all these different superheroes who have been attached to the tower, that Martian Manhunter, Power Girl, they all begin to join the fray, and it's this mad dash to face off against Alexander Luthor, destroy the tower, and try to save the multiverse. Now, the reason why this whole act is being committed, why everything needs to be saved, is because what Geoff Johns did is he basically established a time clock. What he said is that with regards to the creation of the multiverse, it's not a contained thing. You can't just like bring one Earth back and then bring another Earth back and then 2 or 3 more Earths back. Then what you do is you start a chain reaction. You become a prime mover, you initiate the creation of the multiverse, and then suddenly Earths start popping up left and right. They just start activating all over the place, and it's basically an endless cycle that will lead to infinite Earths. The problem with this is that it's not created organically, it's created artificially. And so what that means is it basically invokes a half-life. Each Earth only has half the energy of the Earth that came before it, so it's diminishing returns. And what'll happen is it'll lead to Earths that are basically completely and totally unstable, and when those Earths begin to destroy, it'll create a cascading event that will basically wipe out the multiverse. And so because of that, the entire multiverse is in and of itself completely unstable. And so eventually it'll all just collapse in on itself. And so in order to keep the end of all things from happening, the tower has to be destroyed. Now, what this also does is it sees Superboy Prime showing up and just absolutely wrecking Black Adam. Now, one of the questions that I've seen asked on Twitter, different things like that, when I did the video on the origin of Superboy Prime is, does magic affect Superboy Prime? The answer to that question is no. Superboy Prime is not affected by magic. Geoff Johns confirms it in this story. Now, the other half of this is because of the fact that Superboy Prime was basically, you know, like the strong arm of Alexander Luthor, because he had killed members of the Titans, because he was such a villainous guy. What we end up having is all of these different superheroes focusing their efforts on him first and then tending to Alexander Luthor later. Now, switching back over to Batman again, the cool thing about this is that, again, we kind of get this back and forth between Batman and Brother Eye, as well as all these different superheroes facing off against Superboy Prime. But what we end up finding out is that Batman's idea, he basically says, look, I designed you physically. I may not control your software, but I designed you physically. I can activate and deactivate aspects of you. And what we end up finding out is the whole thing here is basically just a ruse. He's buying time in order to allow Mr. Terrific, the third smartest man in the world, to begin the process of activating the propulsion system for Brother Eye and moving him out from where he's currently located at. Now, the reason why this matters is because of the fact that if Brother Eye is destabilized, it'll go towards the efforts of destroying the tower of Alexander Luthor. And so again, this is really just a scenario where Brother Eye begins recalling all these these different OMACs directly to where Batman's located, and Batman in turn invokes the Green Lanterns. So that's how the Green Lanterns begin getting involved in this. Now, they were already involved to a degree, but they're more so now than they were before, because we basically have two major skirmishes taking place right now. We have the battle where the tower is, which is where Superboy Prime, Power Girl, Martian Manhunter, so on, and then we have this battle out in space with Brother Eye, which is Batman, Booster Gold, Blue Beetle, and then like a ton, like a whole bunch of members of the Green Lanterns. Now, this is cool because we basically get round 2 of Superboy Prime facing off against Superboy. But the funny thing is here, much like the first time around, while Superboy's able to hold off, while, you know, Connor Kent's able to fight pretty well, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. You know, Superboy Prime is still able to overpower him. Now, in a last-ditch effort, you know, some kind of a trump card, Connor Kent flies Superboy Prime into the tower and destroys it. And what it does is it basically shatters the multiverse and then takes all these different Earths and restores them back into New Earth. And so it was almost like this whole, you know, explosion of Earths outward and then those Earths coming back into New Earth. So that's one of the things, if you ever do like Google searches, you ever do any research and they talk about how during Infinite Crisis, the multiverse was reborn and then destroyed, that's exactly what this means. The problem is that in the midst of its fight with Superboy Prime, Connor Kent is killed by Superboy Prime. And so again, this is kind of a crazy scenario. Now, one of the funny things about this is that Connor Kent was supposed to stay dead. The reason why he was supposed to be gone is because of the fact that, remember, Infinite Crisis serves as a soft reboot. And this is one of those instances we were talking about where Geoff Johns was deciding who gets to leave and who gets to stay, you know, who gets to live and who gets to die. Connor Kent was supposed to die because he was just a holdover from the death and return of Superman. And DC just never really knew what to do with him. And in fact, if you go and read Geoff Johns, you know, his whole run on like Teen Titans, what he's basically doing is building up to this point where Connor Kent was supposed to die. The problem with this is that DC editorial didn't want to keep it that way. And in fact, he actually comes back during like, what is it, like the Legion of Three Worlds or something like that? I can't remember off the top of my head what the story was called, but he's basically resurrected. And what ends up happening is he just gets thrown into a Kryptonian regeneration matrix, and they end up bringing him back the same way they brought back the old Superman. The other half of this is that with the death of Connor Kent, this is when they basically say Superboy Prime is beyond the point of no return. Now, the other half of this equation is, remember, we still have the Secret Six, the Super Society of Secret Villains. Alexander Luthor, posing as Lex Luthor, freed all these different villains from across the world, and they're all basically tearing cities apart, ripping things to pieces, just having a good old time. And so because of this, Earth 2 Superman and Earth 1 Superman, of course, basically take out Doomsday, and then from there, their question is, who do we take out next? And their immediate focus is Superboy Prime. But the funny thing about this is that Superboy Prime actually faces off against Bart Allen, and this is when Geoff Johns begins to hearken at one of the only two weaknesses that Superboy Prime has. The first weakness is a legitimate weakness, which we'll actually see later on here in this story. But the second is really more of like a fear or a phobia. Superboy Prime is terrified of speedsters. And the reason why is because of the fact that when Superboy Prime was forced back into the Speed Force, to his mind, he was stuck there for years. Now, in terms of the armor that he wears, this is something that Geoff Johns does not fully explain. He addresses it, but he doesn't really fully explain it. All we know is that Superboy Prime built this armor to basically absorb solar radiation into his body and to store it while he was in the Speed Force. Now, the reason why this matters is because for Superman, for your average run-of-the-mill regular Superman as a whole just absorbs solar radiation. He's a solar battery. All right, his body absorbs solar radiation to the point that it just can't absorb anymore, so that if he ends up going to a planet where there's like a red sun or something like that, his body will basically use up that solar radiation until there's none left, and then he'll just be a regular person. The suit that Superboy Prime has takes it a step further. It's like a battery pack for solar radiation. He puts the suit on, and then the suit itself absorbs solar radiation in addition to what his body already has. And so it allows him to fight longer, harder, and faster than any of the other Supermen or superheroes. Now, in truth, it doesn't really matter anyway, because he's already so overpowered that it almost makes the point moot. But what it does is it pushes his powers a step further. Now, with regards to the fact that he is running an absolute muck here, what ends up happening is he basically leads the superheroes on a merry chase and ends up being encountered by the Green Lanterns. But before we get into that, what I want to do is I want to switch back over to Alexander Luthor. And the fight with the various superheroes are subduing these members of the Secret Six. What ends up happening here is that Alexander Luthor goes to kill Batman, and Dick Grayson jumps in the way. Now, if you go read interviews, DC will tell you Dick Grayson was supposed to die. He was not supposed to live. He was supposed to be gone. And the reason why was because of the fact that DC was looking at Dick Grayson as a whole, and they said, this guy's been around since like 1940, since Detective Comics number 39 or something like that. I don't remember what issue it was off the top of my head, but he's been around for decades. I mean, he's been around for years and years and years and years. And they were like, it's time to get rid of him and replace him with someone new. The problem with this, and the reason why DC was talked out of it, was because there were other members in the DC camp that were like, if you kill Dick Grayson, Grayson, fans will riot, like they will lose it. You cannot kill Dick Grayson. That's one of the biggest mistakes you would have made. They would have lost their mind. So in the end, DC chose not to kill Dick Grayson and just have him injured really, really, really bad. But because of the fact that Superboy Prime basically takes off to the depths of space, what ends up happening here is that Hal Jordan calls in all the other Green Lanterns that are out in their various sectors, recalls them all to the location of where Superboy Prime is heading to, and has them all face off. And so what we end up having is Superboy Prime versus a Guy Gardner-led Green Lantern team. And let me tell you something, Rob, let me tell you something. This is a sight to behold, dude. It's one of the coolest things ever, because they're making statements, like the thin green line will stop him cold. Superboy Prime's response is like, you guys don't know cold. And he starts killing, just ripping them to pieces. I mean, there's no contest here. I mean, he's just tearing them to shreds. He crushes them so bad that the standard operating procedure of the Green Lanterns to preserve life is cast aside, and they're given permission to kill Superboy Prime. Now, the reason why this is important is because if a Green Lantern, unless his permission is given, if a Green Lantern goes and tries to kill someone, the ring will stop them. The ring will keep them from doing that. That's one of the things that Geoff Johns really focused on a lot when it came to the lead up to Sinestro Corps War and during the Sinestro Corps War, is that the Guardians of the Universe permanently installed in the Green Lantern rings the ability to kill members of the Sinestro Corps. Because what Sinestro did is when he made his own Lantern Corps, he basically set it up so that his rings will allow members of the Sinestro Corps to kill anybody. And so it was basically, creating a way to counter the Green Lanterns. And so because of this, the Green Lanterns are given the ability to kill, and it doesn't matter. Superboy Prime is still crushing and stomping every last one of them. Let me tell you something, man. Let me tell you something, man. If God was writing Superboy Prime right now, this is what it would look like right now. It's one of the coolest things that I've ever seen, to see him just crushing all these Green Lanterns. Now, the reason why this is important is because when we pick up with Green Lantern Corps Recharge, they'll reference this moment. They'll actually talk about how he killed some 40 Green Lanterns without even trying. And so what ends up happening is that in this last-ditch effort, with this recognition that Superboy Prime simply does not seem to be able to be stopped, Earth 1 Superman and Earth 2 Superman grab him and race him to the Red Sun from where Krypton was destroyed. Now, the funny thing about this is basically Geoff Johns showing the arrogance and how far Superboy Prime has fallen. Because in his mind, to his immediate thought, well, they're taking me to Kryptonite, to where Krypton used to be. Well, that Kryptonite doesn't affect me. Like, these guys are boneheads. They're not paying attention. Flying him through a red sun effectively begins to negate all of their powers. It destroys the armor of Superboy Prime, and then it begins to basically draw away the energies of Superman, because remember, they start to lose their powers in the presence of a red sun. And so, like asteroids falling onto a planet, they crash onto the Green Lantern planet Mogo, and then they all just start duking it out. Now, in the process of all this, Superboy Prime kills Golden Age Superman, or really kind of beats him to death. But the cool thing about this is that Earth 1 Superman lets Superboy Prime have it. And the reason why is because they're both in the presence of a red sun. Now, the reason why I say this is significant is because remember, in our origin story of Superboy Prime, red sun energy did not affect him. He had no weaknesses. He wasn't weak to magic. He wasn't weak to kryptonite, or kryptonite didn't exist. He wasn't weak to red sun radiation. He was stronger, faster, had more energy than every Superman who had ever existed. Superboy Prime was, in essence, 1950s, 1960s Silver Age Superman. All strength, no weakness. In order for Geoff Johns to be able to just end this story, he had to give him a weakness. And so he basically just throws red sun radiation in there. Now, in truth, Geoff Johns is probably looking at the obscurity of Superboy's origin in the sense that it's a very difficult story to find. And unless you know where to look, you'll never find it. And so it's just, Superboy Prime is just this version of Superman that exists out there that's really OP. And so I imagine Geoff Johns is just kind of relying on that obscurity in order to help him pass the story off, which it works. I mean, it's fine. I mean, Superboy Prime, as much as I love him, he's got to have a weakness, and so it just makes sense that we would see him being weak to red sun radiation. And so because of this, because he's in a weakened state and his powers are effectively dwindling away, the Green Lanterns arrive just in time to basically encase him in Green Lantern energy and then whisk him off to a science cell on Oa in the center of the universe, where he's basically going to be held prisoner in the presence of a red sun, which again completely negates his powers. And so what ends up happening here is that with Golden Age Superman dying, it really just kind of transitions to the fallout of all these different events, and it's basically just sort of this epilogue where it continues on with things as they're heading forward. The idea that we still have the new Blue Beetle, Jamie Reyes, where these characters are going to go from, Power Girl, Wonder Girl, Cassie Sandsmark, the new Spectre, all these different things that are sort of coming out of Infinite Crisis going forward into the future of DC Comics. But for those things, they're not really relevant to us because we're doing this strictly to help us understand what's going on in Geoff Johns' Green Lantern mythos a little bit better. But there's actually two epilogues that come into this story. The first is that we pick up with Alexander Luthor who survived everything. He survived the whole return of the multiverse, all that kind of good stuff. When his idea is, I'm going to try again. Like one day I will try again. I'm going to recreate the multiverse and I'm going to find the perfect Earth. But what ends up happening is that as he's making his way through Gotham, he's attacked and killed by the Joker. And the reason why is because the real Lex Luthor shows up and says the biggest mistake you made, besides impersonating me and all that kind of stuff, was that when you reformed the Secret Six, you didn't invite the Joker. And that's why the Joker killed him, because he didn't get an invite to the party. That encapsulates Joker so well. Joker's the kind of guy to find out that somebody's having a party, somebody's having like a great big amazing birthday party in Gotham City, and there's gonna be all kinds of crazy stuff, like an adult birthday party, but there's gonna be all kinds of crazy stuff. He didn't get an invite, so he goes in there and just shoots the place up. That's the kind of thing that Joker would do. But the other epilogue that we get is Superboy. With all these different superheroes basically learning from their mistakes, really their lessons from the return of these different Earth 2 Supermen, what ends up happening is that with Superboy Prime confined inside of this science cell, he carves the Superboy symbol onto his chest and then simply says, I've been in places like this before, I've been in worse, and I've always managed to get my way out. And so what this does is this segues directly into Green Lantern Recharge as part of the Geoff Johns Green Lantern mythos. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I love Superboy Prime, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.